A reveal investigation has uncovered an unprecedented number of people who died inside Georgia prisons last year.
Even after the officer found Bobby not breathing, he's seen walking to get help.
I have never seen the prison so chaotic, so violent, and so out of control.
By one count, 44 states don't have air conditioning in all their prisons. 10 of those states are in the South, where the heat wave has been unrelenting. Temperatures as high as 145
is inhumane.
Tense moments in a Minnesota prison today when about 100 inmates refused to return to their cells.
Marvina says the men were protesting their movement being restricted, limiting their access to clean drinking water in the hot prison.
The Supermax is life after death. It adds punishment to the crime, in my opinion, far much worse than death.
The United States represents 5% of the world's population, and yet it's home to nearly 25% of the world's prison population. The only country with more people in prison on Earth is China. China is home to 1.4 billion people. By comparison, the United States has a population of only 330 million people, and yet the United States has only around 25,000 fewer prisoners than China. And now, a former US president may be joining the ranks of the incarcerated. As a 77-year-old white alleged billionaire, Trump is not representative of the average prison population. So in honor of our former commander-in-chief potentially serving some serious jail time, I wanted to present him with a little handy primer, a guide to the US prison industrial complex, one which he helped further privatize during his tenure as president, one where 42% of the prison population is made up of black men, despite the fact that black men only make up 6.5% of the whole US population. In a country where spending on prisons sits at around $87 billion per year, where spending on prisons and jails has increased at triple the rate of spending on public education over the last 30 years. And yet, despite this public spending, it's also a country where the prison population is subject to forced labor, non-existent healthcare, squalor-like cell conditions, poor hygiene and nutrition, and extensive use of corporal and other inhumane punishments. Lord knows that if Trump were to be sentenced to any actual jail time, he'd get some sort of Pablo Escobar-style rich person prison, because prison is really meant to punish the poorest among us. And it was designed as a place to control the vast populations of people of color who could no longer be legally controlled via enslavement. This is why so many people are in prison in the US. Roll the intro. My perfect angel daughter Moira and I would like to thank my partner on today's video, Sundays. Most healthy dog foods are frankly an expensive frozen mess. And I don't know if you've ever met a bulldog before, but being goopy is not something that they need help with. So adding goopy foods to the mix is really not it. Sundays is dog food that works with your life. No defrosting, no prep, no cleanup, just healthy and easy. Sundays is 100% human grade and uses only real food ingredients that you can recognize, pronounce, and probably eat yourself. It's not kibble, pre-cooked, or frozen. It's gently air-dried to preserve nutrition and flavor. It was founded by veterinarian Dr. Tori Waxman because she couldn't find a dog food that was as nutritious as home-cooked meals or as convenient as dry food. So, over 3 years and over 17 formulations, she made it herself. We love that. And Moira loves Sundays, don't you? You love it? I get that starting your pup on a new food is a big deal, which is why Sundays offers samples. This gives your pup a chance to try Sundays and fall in love. You just pay shipping and handling. And when you're ready, check out the link in my description and use this code to get 35% off your first order. Thanks, Sundays. Can you say thank you, Sundays? What are you looking at? Is it a ghost? Prison hasn't always been the preferred method of punishment for those convicted of crimes. It only goes back a couple hundred years to the French and American Revolutions. Before that, capital punishment was the preferred form of punishment. Executions were often public and brutal. If execution wasn't ordered, the convicted were usually doled out some form of corporal punishment or public shaming. A public whipping, getting stuck in the pillory, cutting off an ear or a hand, or branding the face or the hands. Punishment was physically painful and turned into a spectacle as a form of deterrence for future criminals. Jails were simply a means of holding on to people that the law wanted to keep track of. This was usually vagrants, debtors, the accused awaiting trial, the damned awaiting punishment, and even those acting as witnesses that the courts wanted to keep an eye on. Jails were often cold, disease and rat-infested basements, and the right to a speedy trial was yet to be enshrined in the Constitution. So the accused could end up spending months or even years in holding, eventually succumbing to the rough conditions before ever getting their day in court. But eventually, public sensibilities changed, thanks to religious awakenings and advancement in medical knowledge, combined with the fact that public punishment didn't really seem to do much to deter crime, so criminal punishment became less of a spectacle, and some academics came together to dream up the idea of prisons and long-term captivity as more humane than public corporal punishment. Plus, at this time in the early 1800s, criminality was beginning to be thought of as a product of a person's environment, as opposed to a racial predisposition, though that's a theory that never really died. So the idea was that creating a controlled environment in the form of a prison where a person was isolated from friends and family and even other prisoners would fix their environmental problems and be a better solution. And despite the fact that the earliest prisons proved that extended periods of solitary time led prisoners to suffer full mental breaks and often led to their muscles fully atrophying from lack of use, the prison became solidified as the primary means of dealing with convicted criminals. All that was needed was just a few tweaks, okay? But eventually they'd figure out a way that was successful. We haven't reached that point, but we have reached a point where we literally can't fathom a different way to manage people who commit crimes, despite the fact that the current system is not working no matter how you look at it. But more on that later. After the Civil War, the 13th Amendment was passed in 1865, marking a pivotal shift in race relations and, it would turn out, criminality in this country. The 13th Amendment outlawed slavery once and for all in this country, but not exactly. There's some really important, often overlooked language in the 13th Amendment that creates a glaring loophole that's been exploited since its ratification. The 13th Amendment says, "Neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as a punishment for crime whereof the party shall have been duly convicted, shall exist within the United States or any place subject to their jurisdiction. No slavery, except as punishment for a crime. Under our laws, slavery is constitutional if it's used as punishment for a crime." With the passage of the 13th Amendment, 4 million people who carried much of the economy, especially of the South, on their backs were freed from their enslavement. And lawmakers in the South took no time to quickly take advantage of the loophole made clearly available in the 13th Amendment. They began passing laws that criminalized trivial behavior most often engaged in by Black and poor people, turning traditional misdemeanors into felonies. Being unable to provide documentation on demand, selling cotton after dark, petty theft, interracial relationships, vagrancy, and loitering were all criminalized, giving law enforcement the right to round up mostly Black people, convict them, and place them in prisons where, under the 13th Amendment, their labor could continue to be exploited. These prisoners were then leased to companies, such as coal mines and railroads, and forced to work long hours with no pay, doing back-breaking work. They would suffer beatings if they didn't perform. They were given poor nutrition and insufficient clothing and lodging. They would be shot if they tried to escape. In Tennessee, up to 10% of the prison population would die every year because of the inhumane conditions that mimic slavery to a T, but were given the constitutional stamp of approval by the 13th Amendment. Very quickly, that badge of slavery transitioned to being fully equated to the badge of being convicted of a crime. Both groups were dehumanized to the point that society generally accepted that these people were deserving of the treatment they received. And frankly, that dehumanization has continued to the present day. Crime rates rose in the 1960s due to the counterculture movement, a growth in poverty and inequality after the economic boom of the 50s, increase in organized crime, and racial bias in law enforcement practices. And politicians used this rise in crime as an excuse to demonize the civil rights and counterculture movements and lean even more heavily into enforcement of law and order. And Black leaders of the civil rights movement became easy targets. As Van Jones has said, "You can tell the story of white leadership in America and never mention the FBI. You can't tell the story of Black leadership in America without having to deal with the full weight of the criminal justice system weaponized against Black dissent." Martin Luther King Jr. was considered one of the most dangerous men in America. J. Edgar Hoover called the Black Panthers the greatest threat to America. Fred Hampton, chair of the Illinois chapter of the Black Panthers, was shot in his bed by police. Activist and scholar Angela Davis was listed on the FBI's 10 most wanted list dismissed, as was Black Liberation Army leader Assata Shakur for arguably false charges, and the list goes on and on. By the 1970s, people were fed up with the growing crime rates. There was a continued focus by the government and the media, especially on the criminality of Black people. Using dog whistles and outright racism, these outlets portrayed Black people as having a predilection for crime, in the same way that formerly enslaved people were treated in the 1860s and the same way enslaved people were treated before emancipation. The idea of Blacks as others, as degenerate half-humans in need of civilizing, this continued in the rhetoric in Washington and the media and had dire consequences for communities of color. These consequences came in the form of prison sentences that disproportionately targeted people of color. And nothing had quite the ring to it like the war on drugs, thanks to Richard Nixon. According to the Law and Order president, public enemy number one is drug abuse. And he leaned heavily on the anti-activist sentiment that had been growing through the unrest of the 1960s, in which Black activists had been painted as the main instigators of crime and disruption. So that by the time the 70s rolled around, the general public was primed to believe that the main source of danger and unrest in the country was the undesirable elements of the Black population, especially those who were impoverished and those who pushed against the status quo in a way that made white America fearful. Fear of slave revolts transitioned nicely to fear of violent Black activist uprisings. And thanks to the builds the social stigma that can increase a person's likelihood of experiencing poverty, homelessness, and drug addiction. Almost a fifth of all people currently in jail are there for a violation of probation or parole. A fifth. And while probation and parole are seen as alternatives to prison confinement, the long terms of this supervision and the numerous and burdensome requirements, including constant surveillance via electronic monitoring, means not only do people not have any expectation of privacy while on probation or parole, this also sets the bar so high that people frequently violate the rules of their parole, often for minor infractions like breaking curfew or failing to pay astronomical supervision fees, leading to more jail time and further tarnishment of their record and the stigma that comes along with all of that. On a larger scale, mass incarceration, wherein Black people and poor people are extremely overrepresented in the incarcerated and formerly incarcerated population, means more control and subjugation of the entire group. Nearly 30% of the Black male population in Alabama today has lost the right to vote as the result of a criminal conviction. For Black men, the likelihood of imprisonment at some point during their lives is 33%. Every Black boy has a 1 in 3 chance of going to prison at some point in his life. That affects how people live, how they raise their children, how they experience their daily lives, how they act in public and in private. Mass incarceration invades every aspect of life for those who live in its shadow. And that's entirely the point. Because, as we've already learned, when slavery was outlawed, that little loophole in the 13th Amendment was immediately exploited to maintain the status quo. As Michelle Alexander, author of The New Jim Crow, has put it, many aspects of the old Jim Crow are suddenly legal again once you've been branded a felon. So it seems that, in America, we haven't ended racial caste, but simply redesigned it. Decades of research has shown that prison is the least effective place to rehabilitate offenders. There are people doing amazing work in the area of prison reform, and it's an uphill battle. The Equal Justice Initiative does work in numerous areas of prison reform, including the death penalty, children in adult prison, wrongful convictions, and excessive punishment, and prison conditions. The ACLU also works to improve prison conditions, push for reduction in incarceration, especially for nonviolent offenders, and promote rehabilitation and treatment programs for those in prison. The alternative alternatives to long-term prison sentences are many. During the COVID pandemic, many states implemented early release for older incarcerated people, especially with health disorders, because research shows that those people are far less likely to commit crimes after release. The Brookings Institute promotes community justice centers, sites that act as a supportive place for people who may be in personal crisis due to mental health conditions, substance use, or family trauma. Using social services to intervene in these situations can lead to better outcomes for individuals and communities than involving the criminal justice system. There's so much more work being done and so much you can do to help, from donating your money to donating your time to volunteering for community-based criminal justice reform efforts. So I encourage you to seek out organizations in your area doing this important work. If you liked this video, you might also like my video about why Americans are so obsessed with guns. Thank you to my Patreon supporters, including my newest patrons, and an extra special shout out to my multi-platinum patrons, Anthony Giles and Brett Piontek. If you're interested in behind-the-scenes content, access to my research and show notes, content about my dog, and all sorts of other stuff, consider joining me over on Patreon today. Thanks so much for watching. Have a good day. Bye-bye!